right, so welcome to those of you just coming in, filing in right now. I'll be brief since we have a lot of ground to cover and we have many participants on the call. This is a Zoom webinar if you're not familiar with it yet. The key difference between Zoom webinar and Zoom meetings is that your cameras and microphones will be disabled by default. So if you want to interact with us, there's two main ways. The first is through chat, and with chat, you're just going to want to reserve that for discussion, comments, and so on and so forth. If you want everyone to see your comment, then make sure you select all panelists and attendees from the drop-down menu there. Otherwise, it'll only be seen by us on the panel. If you have a question that you want to pose to Monique, or for that matter to the group at large, use the Q&A function there. You can ask those questions anonymously. Everyone can view all active questions. You can add your own comments to them, and you can upvote them as well. So that'll help us out massively with a group this size in terms of making sure we get to as many questions as possible. So without further ado, I want to hand it off to Melanie Gottlieb.
Thank you, Mike. Good afternoon. I'm Melanie Gottlieb, Deputy Director of Acro, and I would like to welcome you to the very first of our mental health series webinars. As always, we are hopeful that our technology will not fail us. This is a large Zoom call, and those of us at Acro, like many of you, remain working from home at the mercies of our home Wi-Fi. So if we have any technical glitches, please bear with us. You may use the chat freely while on this webinar. If you have a question for our panelist, for our presenter, please use the Q&A section to ask that question specifically, and we will get to it at the end. I want to just talk for a moment about this series. We planned the series in response to the many conversations we've had since this spring with our members who are managing the personal and professional fallout from the pandemic. You have been asked to reinvent your jobs over and over again, to support your staff, to support your students, and support your families. And we know that it's taking a toll. Our surveys are indicating an unprecedented level of stress for all of you, and we wanted to give you something back that might help you to navigate this crisis. Next slide. We're lucky to have with us today Acro member and Acro Ascend Leadership Program faculty member, Dr. Monique Perry-Graves. Dr. Perry-Graves is an award-winning administrator, educator, leadership coach, speaker, and author. She currently serves in dual leadership capacities at York Tech at the college's campus as the college's campus operating officer, overseeing off-site campuses in Chester and Lancaster counties, and Associate Vice President for Enrollment Management. I would like to turn it over now to Dr. Graves, Dr. Perry-Graves.
Thank you, Melanie, and welcome to everyone. I really do want to take the time to commend Acro as a member and as someone that partners with Acro. I really think it's an awesome opportunity for us to have these conversations and for this series to be kicked off, and the responsiveness of Acro to the members in the moment. So I do want to take the time to thank Acro for that and thank Acro for the opportunity to share today. I do want to welcome everyone. We are very excited at the turnout today, and I'm just going to jump right in to our conversation today. We will have time, as was mentioned earlier, at the end of the session for Q&A, but please don't wait until that time to type your questions and comments. I would love to continue to see your reactions, challenge, and inquiries about our conversation today. So this topic at hand about the complicated nature of our work and how that really spans across the people element and the performance element is what we're going to center our conversation on today. So our agenda is going to highlight a couple of different broad themes. We're first going to kind of ground ourselves in the construct of what our headlines and realities are for today, for STEM professionals, for STEM leaders, and then some of the priorities that leaders need to keep in mind. And then we want to make sure that you're able to walk away with some pragmatic tools for your toolkit, because it really is about continuing to build that toolkit, sharpen some of the tools in the toolkit we really have already, and then Q&A, as I mentioned before. So I first want to start off with the backdrop. This is a snapshot from a recent conversation in my area. I live in the Charlotte area, and South Carolina is where I'm located as far as my institution. And there was really some conversations as of late at one of our major foundations about the impact of COVID-19 on education overall. And I think as we consider the leadership that we have to employ in today's environment, it's really important for us to be grounded in the environment that we're in. So a couple of key things from this slide that I did want to call out specifically is based on the impacts of COVID-19, over 190 countries have closed schools, and that impacts over 1.6 billion students over the course of the pandemic. Obviously, the pandemic hit certain countries before it hit the United States. And so most of our school districts in our area and throughout the world are employing some type of virtual or hybrid type of remote learning. The ramifications of that are going to impact the entire community, but they will most impact those that really can't afford to be impacted, our lower income, our students of color, our minoritized students. And so when we think about things like our achievement gap, which we are always constantly working to close at the higher education level, the long-term impacts of that we will see in the future. And then some of the challenges of our youngest learners, where we see the trajectory, not just of learning, but of poverty begin. Many of them are not getting some of that early childhood development because the parents are not sending them to daycare. They're unable to send them to daycare, or in some cases, the daycares are not open. So that's just a quick snapshot from a broad education perspective. If we consider some of the realities for higher education, in particular in STEM leaders, I want to talk about some of the non-institutional realities. So obviously there is a global awakening and reckoning with systematic racism and social justice issues. That's compounded by some of the racial battle fatigue that many of individuals of color may feel in the context of what's going on. As you think about those issues, as we think about the pandemic of COVID-19 and other ripple effects of things going on in our communities, there are a heightened number of physical and mental health concerns. If we think about individuals that have certain conditions, certain diseases, the inability to be able to go to the doctor for routine treatments, or the disruption of that has caused heightened anxieties. Election fatigue. So this is definitely not a political conversation, but I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that no matter what your political leaning is, just the fact of the election and all of the other associated aspects of that, not just at the national level, but for many of us, we live in communities that there are state level and local elections, just the fatigue of that being in the conversation. I referenced the learning loss at the K-12 level prior. But also another external intersection and impact that we're against as leaders is the family dynamics. So a lot of times as leaders, we assume that family dynamics are some of the challenges that people are facing have to do with individuals that are parents or guardians. And that is true, but we also have to remember that if someone does not have children, does not mean they do not have families, whether that's extended family members, that they're taking care of, friends that have become family. So all of those dynamics come in play. Secondarily, there also have been many rites of passages that have been canceled, augmented, changed, that people are mourning. They may not rise to the level of someone that may have a physical concern or some of the other pressing issues at the national level, but we have to acknowledge the compounding of all of these things on individuals. And then obviously in some cases, some households have significant income impacts, whether that's related to a layoff, whether that's related to a furlough. We all have to consider that those are some of the things that not just our students are contending with. Then if we think about higher education and some of the professional realities that we may be facing, from a SIM perspective, obviously enrollment is the revenue engine for the organization. Retention definitely is equally important, but if we think about net new revenue to the organization, the impact of the pandemic and other things has shifted the way that our funnel may look. It has shifted the way that our students may be behaving in the funnel, and it's also caused us to shift the way that we engage students and even serve them across the entire student life cycle. Depending on your institution, 2-year, 4-year, public, private, nonprofit, you may be experiencing some additional pressure and financial realities. For example, some state institutions, while they are state funded and state supported, may not have a high percentage of state revenue for their operations. That's where my institution falls into that bucket. So the enrollment of the institution is very important to the yearly and annual budget as well. Some institutions have experienced furloughs and layoffs. And so those have an impact on the mental state of the institution. And in some cases, it may have an impact on the institution's capacity to serve. The shift to the hybrid remote work environment has been significant for everyone. For many of us in enrollment management and student affairs, by nature, we are very extroverted people or ambiverted people, a mixture of both, and some introverts, which is okay, but we enjoy people, we like being around people. And even though we are interacting with each other via the means that we are now, that does not take the place of how things were prior to the pandemic. In that vein, we have to be supportive to our students and to our faculty as they're continuing to adjust to this hybrid and remote learning environment. Coupled with that, we have to continue to perform. And so remaining engaged as leaders and remaining engaged as employees is important to that. We have to support our employees. Many of the issues I mentioned on the past couple of slides, our employees are facing, and some of our students are as well. And so it's important to provide that support to employees while also extending healthy boundaries and expectations. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on in our conversation today. And then finally, the prioritization of leadership self-care practices. So if you're like me, a lot of times when you hear the term self-care, you think a bubble bath, and you think you're at the spa. And so in the environment that we're in now, self-care is critical to our mental survival. We cannot lead our organizations, we cannot lead our functions, we cannot serve our students who need us more now than ever before if we are not taking good care of ourselves. So a recent article that I ran across that I thought was just really, really critical is an article that talked about why over the course of the pandemic, now that we're in 6, 7, 8, 9 months now, you might have a feeling of constant tiredness. So you wake up tired, even though you might exercise all the time, there's just this feeling. And so the article talks about how our surge capacity has been depleted. And so the simple way of describing that is experts say that when we first encountered the pandemic or some type of event to that level, there's a level of, and I'm simplifying it, adrenaline that comes that would really only come in this type of major situation that we employ to really get through our days. If we think about that compounded with some of the other issues that have transpired through the pandemic and the length of the pandemic, they're now saying that surge capacity is depleted because it really wasn't designed for us to maintain that level of surge capacity. Another thing that experts are saying that individuals are experiencing, especially those that are high performers in the workplace, is a sense of ambiguous loss. And basically what they mean by that is that people who are used to achieving, they're used to solving problems and getting things done, having a routine and habits, it's a lot harder to do that now. It doesn't mean that you can't have a habit. It doesn't mean that you can't have a routine, but we all know that those things have been changed. And so it takes a little bit more time, effort, and intentionality to actually experience that. So with that said, our conversation today is going to start with us. So one of my favorite quotes that I use in a lot of different contexts is that we must look in the mirror before we look out of the window. So as leaders, we have to look at what we're doing for ourselves, where we are in this environment, before we can really take steps to ensure that we're leading our teams remotely the way that we can to support our students and our goals. So in this situation, we're going to be focusing on what we can do to make sure we go first and make sure that we put on our oxygen mask first, like they always tell us when we fly or when we used to fly. It's been several months since I've been on a plane. So you'll see quotes sprinkled throughout this presentation. I love quotes. They just kind of give us a way to ground things. And so this quote from Brene Brown really crystallizes that who we are is how we lead. So those things are connected. So that's why we're going to have this conversation about who we are as leaders. What are the things that we need to embody and pay attention to in this unique environment that helps give us a foundation to lead with the compassion for this remote environment. So I want to share with you some research from the Center for Creative Leadership, which is a global leadership entity that focuses on training for major global corporations. And so here is a chart where they list their 10 characteristics for a good leader. And so it starts with, obviously at the top, integrity. That's very, very important for any leader. I don't think anyone hopefully would disagree with that aspect of things. Also, the ability to delegate, communication, self-awareness, also known as emotional intelligence, gratitude, learning agility, influence, empathy, courage, and respect. So we're going to dive down a little bit into the workplace and talk about empathy, because we can't really talk about compassion unless we talk about empathy as well. So the next quote I want to share with you is that the best definition of compassion is that it's empathy plus the desire to help. Another perspective I want to share is that empathy is about being concerned about the human being and not just their output. And so when we think about empathy, depending on your personality type, a lot of things may come into mind. So empathy does not necessarily mean sympathy. That's another term. But when you're trying to be empathetic and compassionate in this current environment, these are some things you need to check for. First and foremost, try to suspend your assumptions and be present in the moment, whether it's a phone call, whether it's a Zoom call. If you're meeting in person, social distance in a conference room, try your best to be present and create the conditions for that. Make sure you're keeping in mind that leadership is service and how important that is to remember that. Listen as if you were a beginner. So if you think about if you're learning something for the first time, or if you're in graduate school, you are very attentive when you're learning a new concept. You're not thinking about what you know about that concept already. You're not thinking about the fact that you talked to someone else about the concept. You really want to have that active listening in place. And if the person doesn't share in a situation where you need to show empathy, enough information where you think you understand the situation, ask additional questions. And then the final two things to listen for is facts and feelings. It's important to listen for both. It's important to understand the difference in both. And then finally, listening for the right reasons. And so I want to pose a couple of questions for us to consider in what I call a mirror moment. So when we think about empathy as leaders, we think about compassion as leaders. It's important in today's environment because we're interacting with many different people. We're interacting with peers, we're interacting with students, we're interacting with other leaders, we're interacting with colleagues outside of our institutions. Do we show more compassion to students than we do others? I remember when I was a teaching faculty at my institution, and there was a big discussion about attendance. And there was one of my former colleagues who has been retired for a long period of time that would, after a student was late 2 minutes to a class, they would mark them as absent for the class. However, every time we had our department meetings, this individual was 15 minutes late. And so as we were having this conversation one day, our department chair called out the fact that he was employing a level of inflexibility with students that was being afforded to him as a professional. And so we always need to be mindful of the fact of we need to show that compassion across the board. And when we think about empathy, we may be faced with situations that we personally have never encountered and may have never been exposed to. But it's important for us to be open to briefly walking in someone's shoes without denying the fact that shoes even exist. And so all of these things come into play, not just when we're talking about leading our teams and the individuals we're responsible with serving, but as it comes with students and all the different constituents that we serve in our colleges and universities. So I want to move into some pragmatic tips, again, from the Center for Creative Leadership on building a remote work culture. And then we're going to talk a little bit about boundaries. The first thing to keep in mind is that you have to foster trust through communication. I think it's important to understand that we have to know what our leadership DNA is. So if you're the type of person that is always communicating, that is something you did pre-pandemic, you may not have to lean into your communications more. But if you're someone that really led significantly by visiting people's offices, walking around, seeing people in person, which is great, but if your institution is primarily working remotely, or obviously in some situations, sitting down in someone's office for an extended period of time may not be the safest situation, you are going to have to pivot what your communication is, because that also helps foster trust. I remember back before higher education when I spent time in private industry in the line of communications, where there was always a common sentiment that in the absence of information, people will make something up to fill the gap. And so in some cases, people don't intentionally do that. But in other cases, we may find that without that, they think something's going on or they're suspicious. So we want to foster that trust. The other thing is using appropriate communication channels. We'll talk a little bit about that. I know we're limited in those channels right now, but we'll talk a bit about that towards the end. Be proactive in resolving conflicts. So we'll talk about some key toolkits, tools in your toolkit about resolving conflict, because just because we're in a pandemic, just because we may be working remotely or in a hybrid fashion does not mean that we will not have conflict. And conflict is not a bad thing. That's a separate presentation, but conflict is not a bad thing. Another thing to keep in mind is that you have to make sure you're clear on roles, responsibilities, and deliverables in order to support collaboration. For some of us, depending on the status of our institutions, we may have people taking on responsibilities on a temporary basis that they had not prior. We may have individuals covering for other individuals. We may have adjusted some operations related to virtual servicing of students and things of that nature. Don't assume that everyone is clear. Make sure that those roles and responsibilities and what those outputs are clear to people. And then in general, if we go back to the headlines and the constructs that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we have employees and students that are going to continue to go through a lot of things as we deal with the various challenges in our society today. We know that there's going to be a point in time that for some of these challenges, we won't be dealing with them. But as a leader, as part of the self-care, but also part of the way of building a healthy work environment, you're going to have to set boundaries. And so let's talk about that a little bit. So in some cases, as we talk to leaders across the nation, as I've interacted with my leaders and coached them, we have found situations that over the course, especially of the pandemic, where sometimes a leader might feel like they're carrying the burdens of their employees or students a bit much. And so whenever you feel that you're carrying the burden beyond the standard empathy, so I do want to underscore that it is okay to empathize with someone. It is okay for something to bother you. It is okay also if there's a student situation that really gets you riled up, if you feel it's a level of injustice or something that you have the ability to fix as a leader. When we get into the unhealthy boundaries is when we become so empathetic, kind of past the normal healthy stage, that we enable a codependency with our staff or our employees. And so that gets into a stage where the employee inadvertently, and you as a leader inadvertently, over the course of trying to be supportive and empathetic, has kind of substituted you for a professional. And so it's really important to be mindful of maintaining these healthy boundaries, not just for your self-care, but also for the self-care of the employee. So it's important to normalize seeking counseling and support. Many of us work in areas where we provide that support to students. We have a lot of conversations about normalizing that to students. We cannot forget that in some arenas, we've got to normalize that to our employees. So make sure that you are well abreast of the assistance programs that your institution offers for employees, and route employees to those situations or those access of those particular resources when you can. Because if you look at the chart here, the codependency could take a toll on you. Because the more and more that you cross that healthy empathetic line, the expectations of the employee for you to serve as that person for them will increase. And so that's when you get into a situation where boundaries are crossed. So say, for example, something happens with the employee and you're at a meeting with another employee on your team. It's not an emergency. It's not something related to the day-to-day operations of the employee's work, but because you've established this, they feel a level of entitlement to your time. And this is just an example. And so you see the cycle that can happen in that situation. Another thing that can happen, especially for those of you that might lead teams of individuals, the optics of that can cause some sentiments among your team that you don't want to plant seeds for. So you have to keep in mind that just because an employee does not share some of their problems or challenges in today's environment does not mean they're not going through them. Because some employees are private, they don't share things in the workplace, and there's nothing wrong with that. But as a leader, you have to be mindful that you have some employees that do and some employees that don't. However, you can't be spending a lot of extra time from an optics perspective with that employee who does, because that can make people think there's a level of favoritism and things of that nature. That does not mean that you don't support the employee. That does not mean you're not there for the employee. It's just a mindfulness as leaders that we have to have about our boundaries in the workplace. So let's talk about managing performance. We talked a little bit about in the remote environment, we've got to be proactive about handling conflict. One of the foundations for this particular webinar today is about the managing of the performance. So the reality for a SIM leader today is that we still have to recruit, enroll, retain, graduate, and place students in jobs or enable them to move on to higher level studies. And so the tenets of a high performing team have not changed due to the pandemic. So I want to share with you some research from a book that was probably out several years ago that was actually a foundation for a Acro journal article that I wrote about managing high performance teams in a SIM environment. And so I want to share these components with you because based on the research of authors of teams that have been wildly successful across many different industries, they uncovered these tenets. So having a clear, challenging goal was something they saw across many of these successful teams. A results-driven structure that was really powered by clear roles and effective communication, competent team members, a joint commitment, meaning that the team members were in support of the mission of the company or organization that they work for, a climate of collaboration, a standard of excellence, support and recognition, and a principled servant leader. So I put this in here to just highlight the fact that just because we're in a pandemic does not mean the values, the aspiration, the level of excellence that we all work for in order to support our students is abandoned. And so that does not change. These values have not changed. And so when we think about how we're managing our employees in this environment, continuing with some of the research from CCL, we have already highlighted on the clarification of roles and procedures and the trust. But I want to also underscore the impact and the recognition of differences. And so all of our employees are very different. The topic of equity, diversity, inclusion, etc., is a very prominent topic. It's a conversation that many of us have had for a while, but it's really been elevated in our current space. And so while this webinar is not about that, I want to make sure that I anchor that when you talk about managing employees in an optimal way, that is a part and that is a pillar and value that great leaders have. And so a pragmatic tool that I want to share with you as we talk about performance is giving feedback. So like many of you, I was taught early on, years and years ago, about the feedback sandwich. So that's if you have some constructive feedback to give to a peer, to a colleague, to an employee, you tell them something really, really good about themselves, you sneak in the constructive feedback, and then you round it out if after that with some positive feedback. One of the things that I have experienced myself over the course of my career and continuing to manage larger teams and ultimately division teams is that depending on the level of the emotional intelligence and self-awareness of the employee or the situation, the feedback sandwich may send mixed messages. So this pragmatic tool from CCL that really outlines the steps that one should take in giving feedback is one that I would highly recommend. So it really enables you as a leader, whether you're someone that tends to avoid conflict. So we talked about earlier, you have to be proactive in addressing conflict and having those conversations. But when we talk about managing performance with compassion, we're not giving anyone any gifts by allowing situations or things to continue and not giving them the proper feedback. That does not mean that we have to be disrespectful. That does not mean we have to violate someone's dignity in doing so. Part of the role of a leader is to always give support and recognition, but it is also to give constructive feedback in private. So the steps here that CCL recommends is that in a situation, and many leaders actually may document this themselves on a piece of paper, they need to think through these thoughts before having a conversation. So talking about what is the situation at hand. Say, for example, your institution is expanding the hours of chat. And so you've had some additional employees at the college that are assisting with that. And so someone is not able to leave their chat coverage, if you will, before another employee comes on. Well, you might be getting a complaint about an employee that's constantly late. And so the employee they're covering for may be compromised because they might be in a situation where they and their spouse are doing some handoffs to help support their children in their virtual learning, and it's causing an issue. And so you could deliver the feedback to say, you're consistently late, which is the situation. And so that's enabling you to not be on the chat at the time that you're scheduled, the behavior. And the impact of that is that you could be compromising someone else in their personal life, in addition to the fact that you're causing frustration among a team member that then could hurt our team overall. And so that really allows you to stick to the facts of the conversation. If it's someone that's emotional, or if you're emotional yourself, it really gives you a way to really bullet point things out in a way that's constructive and clear. So I would definitely challenge you to consider, if you've been using the feedback sandwich, adding this to your toolkit. Another thing to be mindful of when delivering feedback is a concept called SARA. And so many of you who may be familiar with the stages of grief, you may see that this resembles this slightly. So another thing to keep in mind is in this environment, depending on the employee, something that might be minor in constructive feedback, like the situation I just explained to you, may resonate on a different level with them. Or if you're a leader where you really have not been proactive in delivering feedback to employees, and that's a tool and a muscle you plan to build and want to work on, they may not be used to you telling them anything that's not good. And so with that in mind, this is a natural response to feedback that you may encounter and you need to prepare for. This may or may not be a response that you encounter, but it's important as a leader, as you are having constructive feedback conversations, to be aware of this, especially if you're someone that is resetting a boundary. So if we talk about earlier in the presentation, if it's someone where you're having to do a boundary reset and you're having to have that conversation, you may encounter this level of response. But as a leader, you have to anchor yourself and know that that is your job to do that. So let's talk about some additional pragmatic strategies to consider. Some of you may be familiar with the book Mindset by Carol Dweck. And I think it's important for leaders, especially in today's environment, to not just identify what mindset they're in, but also share the mindset expectations for the teams that they lead. Because we're going to have to continue to pivot and re-engineer and reinvent how we do business far beyond the time of our pandemic being over. And so in Carol Dweck's work, she talks about a fixed mindset and a growth mindset based on her empirical research. People with a fixed mindset think that intelligence is static. They tend to get defensive in situations and give up very easily. They see efforts to attack problems and to solve problems as fruitless. They ignore useful feedback, and they're threatened by the success of others. As a result, these individuals may plateau earlier in their career, or they're limited in their potential. People with growth mindset have a desire to consistently learn, and so they tend to embrace challenges. They tend to persist in the face of setbacks, and they have a strong level of grit and resilience. They also find lessons and inspiration in the success of others. So if they have a colleague that's doing well, or if a colleague has information that they could find useful, they find that inspiring and they celebrate those successes. And as a result, leaders with growth mindsets tend to have higher levels of career progression and an infinite level of achievement in their careers. This also is a mindset that many times, from an academic and pedagogical perspective, you find faculty integrating into their coursework to try to develop this mindset for students as well. And so as we talk about the growth mindset and the ability to develop resilience as a leader, the reframing of how you think is important. And so that is really the connectivity to the mindset question. With everything being thrown at us in our careers, everything being thrown at us in how we're adjusting to our current normal, the intentionality of our mindset is important. So you may not be someone that has experienced significant impacts due to things going on now, but all of us have had to adjust in some kind of way. Focusing on trying to get as much sleep as you can is a very pragmatic thing to build your resiliency as a leader, but to focus on. And then if you're on the opposite end of that spectrum and you find yourself sleeping more than probably what you need to, try to find a substitute to that with meditation, yoga, if you're a person of faith, investing at that time in that area. And then obviously trying to keep the power of positivity. I am a very authentic leader. That's one of my core values. So I'm definitely a realist, but I never am in a situation, especially in the business that we're in, that I lose hope that we can make things better. It may be incremental. It may not be things that we may not see immediately. We may be planting seeds or helping others make things better, but we have to continue to have some type of positivity and hope in what we do. Another strategy that I want to share from a pragmatic perspective that I use with my current leadership team is how I structure meetings. And so I think it's important, especially with Zoom fatigue and a lot that's going on with our communication with each other and all the topics, that we don't abandon the fact that we still need to be having conversations with our teams, with the individuals we're responsible for serving about their growth. So our regular meetings that occur on a regular schedule and frequency are more of what I call transactional meetings. So those are the update meetings, those are the operational based meetings. And then on a periodic basis, usually once every 2 months, I will have a transformational meeting. And so that's a meeting where I want them to discuss where they are from a career perspective. If we've got a professional development plan, not in a negative filter, but in the filter of what are some things, some skills, some learning, some conferences, some things that you want to participate in this year to make sure you're building your toolkit and how I can support that. And then just overarching strategies and just things that we talk about. And so those meetings are only limited to that. They can't have any transactional items creep into those meetings. So it's important that if we haven't had those higher level macro touch points with our employees, that we make the opportunity to change the subject. We do not want people to think that in the pandemic that we cannot still grow and that we do not still care about their progress and development as employees and leaders. There's some more brass tacks things that I want to share with you that have worked is a consideration of varying modalities. Everything does not need to be a Zoom meeting. One of the things that I tend to do, especially in my one-on-one meetings, knowing that my leaders, including myself, are on Zoom meetings throughout the day. For many of us, Zoom, FaceTime, all those things we're engaging in our personal lives as well, is that I will give them the choice to have a conference call if they would like to. Now, there are situations where we do need to have a Zoom meeting, and especially if I haven't seen the employee, whether it's on campus or whether it's via another Zoom meeting, just kind of want to put your eyes on someone. But if you've already had that interaction, be mindful of the fact that sometimes your employees may need permission to have a call, or if it's something quick, it's okay to pick up the phone or jump on a conference call to do that. Another thing that we've been doing is virtual coffees or lunch. So one of the things that for us, especially for those of you that lead larger teams, the inability to get together in person as a division or as multiple departments, you can do that on Zoom, but that's just not the same, usually because you're giving updates and it's a more formal meeting. So based on some of the feedback from our division, I've started doing virtual coffees. And so I schedule this early in the morning. It's optional. And so we just talk about different things that really don't have anything to do with work. Not anything inappropriate, but the last time we had a virtual coffee was during the Amazon Prime Day. And so I was talking to them about how my husband was saying that every time he opened the door, there was an Amazon box every hour. And we were also talking about our latest streaming series that we were watching. So just a time to relax, for people to interact in a smaller environment and also stay connected to their leader. This is especially important for those of you that lead leaders because you don't have the opportunity to walk down the hallway or walk into another building and see some of the individuals that comprise your organization. The virtual coffee and lunch idea came out of a survey that we actually did of the employees in our division. We wanted to do a temperature check as far as how they were doing, what they needed to be engaged. And that was just a quick Survey Monkey 5-question survey that we put together and sent out to everyone. And we really did also ask them to rate our communication thus far as well. So it enabled us to see what was working, what we were doing well. Is the frequency of our meetings going well? Are they getting the information that they need from us? Obviously, the college as an institution is communicating, but you also have to communicate as a leader. And so I definitely encourage you to consider ways to get feedback from your employees, informally or formally. There are some individuals that will not give certain feedback unless it is in a survey form. And then as we wrap up, I do want to recommend a couple of resources I love to read. So this is just snapshot of a couple of books related to our topic today that I would recommend. Acro has a number of publications in its suite. One of the publications that I contributed a chapter to, but there are many leaders throughout the Acro membership, senior leaders that contributed to the compilation book, Mentorship in Higher Education, that provides a lot of practical advice as well to leaders in very short chapters. So every leader has a short chapter where they focus on a certain topic. I am a big Brene Brown fan, and the book Dare to Lead that talks about daring and brave leadership is something that's a concept that all of us could get some inspiration from. Randy Zuckerberg's Pick 3 talks about all the different focus areas of a professional's life and how you really can't pick everything at the same time, and how we go about integrating our work and life, because it's not a balance, it truly is a integration. And then finally, Dr. Henry Cloud is known for his empirical research and work on the concept of boundaries. And so he has many different boundaries books. This is the core book about boundaries in general. There's some other books that talk about boundaries in personal situations and also as leaders. I recommend that book. The book does have some spiritual undertones, but it's not a spiritual book. But the concept of boundaries and the long-term research that he's done in that area is something that's highly recognized by professionals. And then I want to leave you with some parting words before we open it up for Q&A. I think it's important that while we have to focus in the current state of the pandemic, true transformational leaders are not just focusing on the now, they're focusing on what's going to be happening in the future. And so a lot of the innovations, the pivots, the adjustments that we're making now may become permanent in a post-pandemic next normal environment. And so we've got to think about how the way that we work, how the way that we experience higher education and how we serve students in higher education may change, and be open to that. And so in a recent article that Acro published leading up to this webinar, there was a quote from that article that I shared that really kind of encapsulates my thoughts about where we are and where leaders are as far as their skill sets. So we are growing and strengthening muscles. Some muscles we've never used before, some muscles we are exercising more than ever. But I strongly believe that at the end of this period of time, that all of us will come out of this with a level of intentionality that these muscles that we've built, the tools that we've added to our toolkit, will serve us in many, many different situations to come. We definitely hope and pray that we don't have to use the tools that we're gonna have and the muscles that we built in another pandemic, but I know that we will have challenges that we'll need to help people face and walk them through. And what better time to be equipped for that is learning and building those muscles now so that we're ready to go whenever those situations occur again. So my call to action for you as we close is, from a SIM perspective, don't lose sight of focusing on the fundamentals. I know we always want to do new things, new initiatives, which is great. So I'm not saying that we don't need to focus on getting better and continuous improvement. But at the end of the day, if we look at what SIM is about at its core, we need to make sure that we are having excellence in the execution of the fundamentals. There's a common quote you hear people say a lot today, is not wasting a crisis. So what are you going to do as a leader? What are you going to do with your team and as an institution to transform the transactional? We can't lose sight of the fact that some of the tweaks and pivots that we're making in things that may seem very transactional are transformative for our students. Because if we think about one change, for many of us, it affects hundreds and thousands of people. We talked about not stopping building your toolkit. Continue to invest in attending things like this at Acro. Continue to go to conferences. Continue to engage and give yourself what I find in many cases the mental break and shift of investing in your self-care from a knowledge perspective. As we continue to walk into different seasons of higher education and what our students demand of us, it's going to continue to call many of us as leaders to stand up and speak up for those that we serve, not just those that we serve as students, but those as we serve as leaders. So if we talk about empathy and the compassion, we have to remember that that also is a value we have to employ in those situations as well. Also keep in mind to give yourself grace. It's important to be vulnerable. It's important to give yourself grace, to understand that you're still trying to make things work to the best of your ability. And obviously, people and students first. You've heard me say it before. You've heard me mention this. I am a big proponent that people do everything, and that a high-performing team results in a excellent student services enrollment management organization. And at the end of the day, as I mentioned before, do not lose hope. We can do this, and give yourself the grace to know that you can, and just keep taking the steps and moving forward. So with that being said, I am going to kick it over to Melanie to lead us in the Q&A. I invite you to connect with me. I am on LinkedIn. You'll see the information here. You can also feel free to email me as well. And again, I strongly encourage you all to continue to participate in these series, along with other programming from Acro, such as the STEM conference coming up as well. So now I'll turn it over to Melanie for our Q&A.
Thank you so much, Monique. You gave us so much to think about. We have quite a few questions, and so I'm going to dive right in. Here's one question. As a leader who will be retiring in the near future, what can I do now to assist my team to prepare for the future, especially since this will most likely occur while we are still in a remote environment?
That's a great question. So I am a fan of not letting retirement be coasting, right? So some of my best colleagues have really gone out. If you think about sports analogies, where you have, you know, some of these preeminent players and it's their World Series. So I think in that situation, what I would recommend is really assessing where your team is. And if we think about toolkits and using that analogy, what are some of the core fundamental skills that you need to make sure are shored up for the team you're leaving behind? And I think that's important. So if you are approaching retirement, you have a wealth of wisdom and institutional knowledge, making sure that those seeds and that fruit is left behind in a way that things are able to flow smoothly once you do retire. And best of luck in your retirement as well.
Thank you. So here's another question. Do you have any suggestions on how to celebrate accomplishments, large and small, during these times?
I do. I think the first thing is you have to know the personality of your team. I rely a lot in my current role, being the Chief Enrollment Management Officer, I lead the department leaders, so I'm not necessarily leading people directly in the departments. So I will ask them questions about, okay, what do people like? You know, what do people typically, because what I might find, you know, great, someone else might be horrified at that. And so in our particular area, food is a big deal. So we've had some virtual situations where I had a virtual meeting where I had music going, and I did a trivia survey, who knows me best? And so I had these I think it was like 5 or 7 questions where everyone had a chance to answer. And from that, I gave like $5 Starbucks gift cards. Those things you can just send electronically because we're not together. And so those things went a long way. If you are in a situation where you can give people time off, in some situations, everyone does not have time. They may have used it for some other reason. There are employees that tell us that, hey, you know, letting me off, you know, a half day on a Friday so I can go offline, you know, is something that's very valuable. So I think finding out what your team does enjoy is good. There are some teams that have game nights. My unit was not as interested in doing something, you know, on a weekend as a unit, that kind of thing. I think people have their natural organic networks within the unit that they're connecting to. But I think all of those things are options, but try out the survey, see what people want to do and what they're interested in, similar to how we think about students. And then you can go from there.
Great, thank you. You mentioned the survey just now, and you also mentioned a survey in one of your tools slides. Can you talk about what some of those questions you might ask on that survey? There's a request to share a sample, which you can't do right now, but maybe you could talk about what's in your survey.
Sure.
Questions.
Sure. And it was a short survey, just like students. If you're asking people a ton of questions, they're not going to respond. And we basically asked questions about to rank us as a leadership team or as a leadership unit on how communication had been going thus far. Because we were asking them to reflect on, we were in our state in a lockdown situation. So we went from pure lockdown and everyone working at home and not able to leave to easing back into this phased approach, like many institutions are having, of going back to work, but then also dealing with some of the complexities that certain employees who could not even return on a hybrid basis. And so we asked them to rate our communication. We asked them to rate the frequency. What did it meet their expectations? Did they want more or less? We also asked them what they would like, and that's where the virtual coffee came out. I will tell you that at first, when they mentioned the virtual coffee and lunch, I thought they meant something among themselves. And so when I went through the feedback with my leaders were like, no, they're talking about virtual coffee with you. So I had to then facilitate that myself, which is why it's important for people to feel comfortable telling you, because it wasn't that I wasn't open to doing it, that just wasn't how it came across in the survey. And then we also asked them to share, was there anything that they needed to be effective in the workplace, keeping in mind the boundaries. We can't solve the beyond problems that we can provide to them or help support them with. So one of the big things that came out of that was dual monitors, some higher end office supplies, like not cross pins, but just some things that typically we wouldn't have in the office related to plugs, and a plug that can do your laptop and your US, things that we can do and that we can order for employees, but that mean a big deal to people who are crafting those corners in their houses and apartments and condos to try to figure out a way to work.
Excellent. So we really only have time for one more question. And so I'm going to try to combine a couple of questions here. I see a couple of questions around leadership changes in a remote environment. So you're getting new bosses, you're getting reorganized, like major change management. And then maybe you might also be able to address in that same thing, thinking about workload management, like it feeling like nothing is ever ending, 24/7.
Sure. So the change management, Melanie, just to clarify, are they facilitating the change or they're part of these changes, just so I can make sure I answer?
It appears they are part of the change as opposed to the change maker.
Okay. All right. So I'm just, in my level of authenticity, I'm just going to be honest that it is not ideal to be doing any type of leadership changes in this current environment. I'm also going to be real to say that you can't stop. In some cases, things are going to happen. So we talked about someone that was retiring. We've had that happen where leaders have departed, people have moved, people have gotten new jobs. And so I think first is just acknowledging that it's not an ideal context for these things to be happening, and not to personalize that, right? Because in some cases, some of these changes might be necessary for the mission. I don't know the situation. Some of them may be changes that would be occurring anyway, like retirements or someone moving. And I think that's where your trust and communication does really come into play for leaders, and the over communication, because you don't have those hallway moments or that, hey, let's get everybody together in the conference room and, have this conversation. And I think as an individual, if you're affected by the changes and they're causing a level of dissonance with you, having a constructive conversation with your supervisor or your superiors to say, hey, I have some concerns about this, or, hey, there's some details about the changes that I didn't have. I was wondering if those were available. If we talk about in the slides, the clarification of roles and responsibilities, that's important. I will also say, as a leader that has had to institute change in a variety of situations, sometimes the details may not be available, right? So also as an individual, you've got to understand that in some cases, it's not that leadership does not want to share it. In some cases, the information is not available. If it's a challenging personnel situation, they can't share it. And if it was you wouldn't want someone sharing your personnel details. I'm not saying that gives you the warm and fuzzies, but that's the realities of leadership. The second part of that question, remind me again, Melanie, I lost it. I was on a tangent about change.
We're like, I think we're at about time. So I think we're gonna have to wrap up right there. But I do want to thank you because it's clear that this is a lot of content that people really need. And so we appreciate you taking the time. The recording, we had lots of questions about the availability of this presentation after the fact. The recording is available on the Acro website once we finish up, and it may take a little while, but it's not, it'll be there by tomorrow at the latest. So I want to share with you here at Acro, we did not get a chance to meet in person at our annual meeting this past spring, but we know that you and your staff continue to have professional development needs, and the months ahead are packed with mostly free programming that will help you to do your jobs now and hopefully stay sane doing them. We have launched a new communication called This Month at Acro to share with you all that's planned. You can also check the calendar on our website at any time. And here's a listing of some upcoming events over the next month. Be aware that we've just released the newest holistic admissions publication. It is an excellent, excellent book. We hope you will check it out. And we've published 2 reports this past month: stranded credits on lost credit story, and guidance and best practices for closing institutions pertaining to student records. Next slide. Last but not least, next week, we have our very first fully virtual Acro conference. It is the Acro Strategic Enrollment Management Conference. We have locked in early bird pricing. We hope that you will join us because this is going to be an excellent, excellent event. Over the past several weeks, the staff has been fully immersed in creating this event for you, and I look forward to seeing you there. Thanks again. We hope you'll join us at one of our other events in the coming weeks. And thank you, and we'll see you again soon.